This is a reading from Saint Lydwine of Schiedam by J.K. Huysmans, translated by Agnes Hastings. Nihil abstat G.H. Joyce S.J. Censor Deputatus Imprimatur Ed EDM CAN Surmount Vicar General West Monastery, Die 30 of November 1922. Preface. The life of Saint Lydwine has been written by three men of religion who were her contemporaries. Jan Gerlach, a relation of hers, was sacristan of the Augustin monastery of Windesheim. He lived many years near the saint, even in the same house, and he tells of her daily life from observation. Jan Brugman was a lay brother of the Observance. He took up the work of Gerlach, translating it into Latin and amplifying it with details supplied him by Jan Walter de Leyde, the last confessor of Lydwine. Thomas à Kempis was sub-prior of the Augustinians of Mount St. Agnes near Zwolle. His relation is abridged from that of Brugman, but as details gathered at Schiedam from those who knew the saint. Jan Gerlach had some fame as a writer, and his soliloquies are still sought for. He was, according to his contemporaries, a very fervent and a very humble monk, and Jan Brugman, a friend of Denis de Chartreux, is quoted by wading in the annals of his order as one of the celebrated preachers of his century, admirable both for the elevation of his eloquence and for the number of his virtues. Thomas à Kempis, one of the presumed authors of the Imitation of Christ, was born the same year as Lydwine and died in the odor of sanctity in 1471, after having written a whole series of mystical works, of which several translations into French were attempted. These three, who wrote the life of the saint, are thus men of good repute, and worthy, on account of their position and probity of their souls, to be believed. One may add, too, that the details of their works can be compared with the official documents drawn up after an attentive and detailed inquiry by the contemporary burgomasters of Schiedam, who passed her whole life in review. No history could therefore be presented under better conditions of good faith and certitude. It must be owned, however, that a history of Lydwine is, thanks to them, a very difficult skein to disentangle. It is, in effect, impossible to adopt a chronological order. Brugman declares frankly that he considered it inconvenient to do anything of the kind, and under the pretext of being more edifying, he groups the scenes or the life of the saint according to the list of qualities which he wishes to impress upon us. With this method, which is equally that of Gerlach and de Kempis, there is no means of knowing whether any event which they relate took place before or after another. This was the fashion of writing adopted by all the hagiographers of that period. They narrate anecdotes pell-mell, only troubling to class the virtues so as to have a store of commonplace to draw up in the case of any other saint. They interlarded these pious recitations with quotations from the Psalms and left it at that. It would seem at first sight that there is a means of applying a remedy to this disorder by extracting and comparing the dates scattered here and there in the three biographies and utilizing them as clues to punctuate the life of the saint. But this method does not secure the promised results. Gerlach and Brugman tell us sometimes of an adventure which they relate as taking place on or about the day of such and such a saint. With these indications, one can indeed place the day in the month, but not the year, which they forget to specify. The more precise dates, which Gerlach especially records, have reference often to episodes of little importance and do not always tally with those of Thomas à Kempis. Very scrupulous when it is a question of noting liturgical feasts and fasts, this writer furnishes us with a number of dates, but how are we to trust them? His dates, if one looks into them, are inexact. Thus he places the death of Petronille, Lydwine's niece, in 1426, and also shows her assisting in her aunt's house at a scene which she was wounded in 1428. One of these dates is consequently false, in this case the second, for the date 1425 given by the two other writers appears certain. Even if the dates were correct and always agreed with one another, we should still stray about at random among various facts dated by others, who are not in the least correct, and there's nothing to indicate how to class these facts. Whatever course one takes, one must, therefore, renounce all hope of chronological precision. Moreover, in the works of the three biographers, several personages appear who are the friends and nurses of Lydwine, but no details are given about them. These minor characters flit about the stage, coming one knows not whence and vanishing one knows not how. And finally, to aggravate the confusion, three of the confessors of the saint were called Jan. Now, instead of adding the surname or the name of their birthplace that distinguished them, the three men of religion give us only the Christian name, so that it is impossible to tell if the confessor Jan of whom one hears in such and such an incident is Jan Pot, Jan Angeli, or Jan Walter. There is indeed very little to go upon in this bewilderment. I do not flatter myself that I have thrown any light upon it. I have made use in this life of the three texts of Gerlach, Brugmann, and Akempis, completing their anecdotes by collation, and I have arranged the events according to the order which seemed to me, if not the most accurate, at least the most interesting and useful. Chapter 1. The state of Europe during Lydwine's lifetime was terrible. In France, first Charles VI reigned, then Charles VII. Lydwine was born in the same year that Charles VI, at 12 years of age, ascended the throne of France. Even at this distance of time, the years of his reign call up horrible memories. They drip with blood and reek of license. And in the light of the old chronicles, behind the dusty veil of history, four figures pass by. The first is a man of weak intellect, with pale face and hollow cheeks, with eyes now dull, now full of fire. He vegetates in a palace in Paris, his clothes overrun with vermin, his hair and beard swarming with lice. This wretched being, before he became demented, had been a familiar figure, debauched, irascible, and weak. It is the king, Charles VI, an imbecile taking part in the wild debauches of those afflicted like himself. The second is an intriguing woman, eccentric, unreliable, and imperious, wearing a headdress ornamented like a devil's head with two horns, and a dress cut very low in the neck, and trailing after her a figured train of great length. She shuffles as she walks, shod in slippers with points 2 feet long. This is the Queen of France, the Bavarian Isabeau, who, absorbed in the writings of some unknown author, takes her place by the side of the husband she abhors. The third is a vain gossip whom the ladies of the court adore, and who shows himself at one and the same time cordial and rapacious, affable and cunning. He oppresses the people, drains the money from both countryside and town, and dissipates it in scandalous escapades. This is the Duke of Orleans, cursed of the people and denounced from the pulpit by a monk of the Augustinian order, Jacques le Grand. The fourth, a little wizened creature, taciturn, suspicious and cruel, is the Duke of Burgundy, familiarly known as John the Pitiless. All four wrangle, curse each other, quarrel, and make it up, executing a sort of devil's dance in the decay of a country already half ruined by the insanity of its king. France is indeed convulsed. Paris is given over to all the atrocities of civil war, with butchers and cutthroats as dictators, who bleed the bourgeois as if they were beasts. The country is overrun with bands of brigands, who overwhelm the peasants, set fire to their crops, and cast the women and children into the furnaces of the mills. There are the criminal hordes of the Armagnacs, the rapacious crowd of Burgundians, and those who stretch out their hands to the English to help them cross the Channel. The English do, indeed, disembark near Harfleur, march on Calais, and meet the French army on the way in the county of St. Paul at Azincourt. They attack and have no difficulty in overthrowing, like ninepins, the long files of heavy knights, prisoned, as it were, in the sentry boxes of armor, and fixed astride their horses, which are motionless, fast stuck in the heavy clay. And, whilst that region is invaded, the Dauphin causes the Duke of Burgundy to be assassinated, who himself had had the Duke of Orleans decapitated on the very day after they had taken the communion from the hands of the same priest, and had been reconciled together. Queen Isabeau, egged on by her need of money, sold herself to the enemy, and obliged the imbecile king to sign the Treaty of Troyes, thus disinheriting her son in the favor of the sovereign of England, who became heir to the crown of France. The Dauphin would not accept this deprivation, but, too weak to resist, he took to flight, and was proclaimed king by some adventurers in a manor house of Auvergne. The country was split into two camps, betrayed by the one, broken by the blows of the other, and pillaged by both. It seemed as if the kingdom of France was doomed. Then, at a few months' interval, the King of England, Henry V, and the King of France, Charles VI, died, but the struggle still continued between the two nations. Charles VII, timid and thoughtless, always with his back turned towards the enemy, ready for flight, abandoned himself to low intrigues, whilst the enemy robbed him of his provinces one by one. There was really no saying how much would be left of France when the heavens were moved and Joan of Arc was sent. She accomplished her mission, repulsed the strangers, led her miserable monarch to Rheims for his sacring, and expired, abandoned by him in the flames 2 years before the death of Lydwine. Thus, the condition of France at the end of the 14th and beginning of the 15th century was lamentable, for as though human enemies were not enough, other scourges were added. The Black Death ravaged the country and mowed down millions of her people, that disappeared and was replaced by the tack, an epidemic much feared for the terrible virulence of its cough. When this died out, the plague reappeared and emptied Paris of 50,000 persons in 5 weeks, leaving 3 years' famine in its train, and then again the tack returned and depopulated the towns still further. If the condition of France was lamentable, that of England, who was torturing her, was hardly better. To the risings of the people succeeded the revolts of the nobles. The King Richard II made himself odious by his debauches and robberies. He set out to quell the troubles in Ireland, but was deposed, and the Duke of Lancaster, under the title of Henry IV, was elected king in his place. Richard II was imprisoned and possibly starved to death. The usurper's reign was passed in moderating discords and discovering plots. He burdened, on pretext of heresy, those of his subjects who had displeased him, and dragged out the feeble existence of an epileptic tormented by the plots of his son, who was eager for the succession. He died at the age of 47, and his son, known till then as a drinker and a bandit, an associate of thieves and women, reveals himself on coming to the throne as cold and imperious, arrogant beyond measure, and of a ferocious piety. The Pharisaism and cupidity of the English race are incarnate in him. He shows the harshness and prudery of the Protestant, and is at once an usurer, an executioner, and a Methodist parson, born out of due time. He renewed the campaign in Normandy, starved towns, falsified coinage, hanged the prisoners in the name of the Lord, and overwhelmed his victims with sermons. But the sport in which he was to have been in at the death grows stale when his army is decimated by the plague. He is, however, victorious at Azincourt. He massacres all those who cannot ransom themselves and extracts enormous sums from others. And whilst their fate is in the balance, he crosses himself, mumbles prayers, and recites psalms. Then he dies at the Castle of Vincennes, leaving an infant heir some months of age. The infant's guardians, one violent and dissolute, the Duke of Gloucester, the other vain and cunning, the Duke of Bedford, ravage France, but are completely routed by Joan of Arc, and dishonor themselves forever in buying her, that they may throw her to the flames after a dishonorable trial. After France and England, Flanders is taken in the flank and overwhelmed by the storm. The history of Flanders is intimately bound up with ours, and she too is wasted by internal struggles for the commercial rivalry between Ghent and Bruges. Year after year, strewed the meadowlands with bones and made the rivers run blood. Ghent reveals herself as a proud and obstinate city, peopled by the ultra-pious and by the eternally discontented. Her trade guilds make her the bivouac of strikers, the camp in which the vile and seditious find a welcome, and all the revolutionaries of Europe are in close communications with her. Bruges seems more civilized and less opinionated, but her pride equals that of Ghent, and her love of money is even greater. She is the great emporium of Christianity, and she appropriates greedily all surrounding towns. She is the implacable arbitrator, and if it is a question of a canal, which will benefit one of these townships at the expense of another, a hatred equaling that of the cannibals springs up. The Count of Flanders, Louis III, tyrannical, vain, and prodigal, cruel, too, and unlucky, threw himself against the people of Ghent and tried to break their obstinacy by persecution. Their chief, Philippe d'Artevelde, marched against him, defeated him, penetrated to Bruges, and there killed for preference its richest merchants, after which he sacked the villages and despoiled the towns. The nobles of Flanders called on France for help. It was a crusade of the nobles against the working classes. Charles VI and the Duke of Burgundy crossed the frontier, were joined by d'Artevelde at the head of an army at Rysbeck, and charged the Flemings, who had foolishly linked themselves together with chains, that retreat might be impossible. The Flemings were twisted and piled one upon another, and suffocated in a very narrow space, without having been able to offer any resistance. It was a triumph of asphyxiation, a battle without injury, a massacre without wounds, a combat during which blood ran only as from casks that are tapped from the bursting veins of their crushed faces. D'Artevelde was, happily for him, found amongst the dead, for after the victory, the vilest passions were unloose. The country was pillaged, and the women and children were murdered. Places unwilling to be destroyed bought themselves with gold. It was your money or your life for these nobles, who had trembled before a troop of undisciplined peasants, showed themselves inexorable. The people of Ghent had recourse to the English, who disembarked to aid them, but gleaned most of the booty left by the French, so that this miserable country became a prey both to those who attacked and those who defended her, though neither depredations nor tortures sapped her incredible energy. Ackermann succeeded d'Artevelde, and, supported by a troop from across the Channel, laid siege to Ypres. Charles VI dislodged him and took Berg, in which he left no soul alive. Then, tired of these orgies of murder, he called a truce. Upon the death of Count Louis III, Philip of Burgundy succeeded. This terrible inheritance came to him by the right of his wife. He renewed hostilities, and the massacres recommenced. Damme was reduced to ashes. The country called Quatre Métiers became a heap of ruins, and, as if these horrors did not suffice, religious quarrels were added to this interminable conflict. 2 popes were elected at the same time, who bombarded each other with a shower of bulls. The Duke of Burgundy stood by one of these pontiffs and expected his subjects to follow his guidance, but they refused, and Philip became irritated and decapitated the leaders of the recalcitrant party. Once more, the Flemings revolted. The churches were shut. Religious offices ceased. Flanders seemed to be excommunicated, and the Duke, exhausted by these disputes, finally left in peace a people he could not control, and contented himself with exacting money in exchange for their liberty of conscience. Such was the situation in Flanders, and if we pass on into Holland, we shall see her torn too by incessant strife. At the moment of Lydwine's birth, Duke Albert, as Rudward, or Vice-Regent of Hainault, governing Holland, Zeeland, and Frisia, the provinces which were united under the title of the Low Countries, he replaced the real ruler, his brother William V, who had gone mad after his impious struggles with his mother, Margaret of Bavaria. Whilst he was under restraint, the country had fallen a victim to a violent feud, and a desperate battle had taken place between the Red Caps, or Hoks, and the Grey Caps, or Cabeljaws. These 2 parties, the Guelphs and Ghibellines of the Low Countries, were the result of the war between William and the Princess Margaret, the one upholding the son and the other the mother. But these hatreds survived the causes which engendered them, for we find them still active in the 16th century. Directly he was named vice-regent, Albert laid siege to Delft, where he subdued the sedition in 6 weeks, and then took arms against the Duke of Gueldre and the Bishop of Utrecht in a scandalous contest between father and son, which seems a fitting pendant to the rivalry between the mother and son of the last reign. William V died, and Duke Albert was proclaimed governor of the provinces. The country, warned by these dissensions, prepared to rest, but Duke Albert was under the influence of his mistress, Adelaide de Polgeest, and betrayed the hoax whom he had son William caused Adelaide to be assassinated in the castle of La Haye, and then, fearing his father's vengeance, fled to France, but arising in Frisia, drew father and son together. Persuaded that the murderer was the only man capable of commanding his troops, Albert pardoned and recalled him. He disembarked at Coimbra, and the slaughter was renewed. Frisia ran with blood, but would not own herself conquered. In the year following, she revolted anew, was subdued, and rose again, this time defeating the armies of the Duke and forcing him to sign a treaty of peace. In courage and tenacity, she might have been a second Ghent. This war was hardly over before another broke out. A vassal, the Lord of Arkell, declaring himself independent at the moment of Albert's death, William VI, who succeeded his father, marched against the rebel, vanquished his garrisons, and obliged him to submit. But the Duke of Gueldre became mutinous, and the Frisians were once more in a ferment. Being very ill and at the end of his resources, William signed an armistice with them after they had captured the town of Utrecht, and died, leaving, besides many illegitimate children, one daughter, Jacqueline, who succeeded to her father's place.